It's my privilege to introduce Rob Colter. You notice as soon as he comes on that we both have taken the advice of Epictetus and we've got our beards, but Rob has definitely got me beat by a factor of maybe 3 or 4, right? Men should, according to Epictetus, men should have beards, if you know that passage. So Rob is associate lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at University of Wyoming. He got his PhD from Northwestern in 2001. And you might know him already if you pay attention to Stoicism Today, because he's written a few articles there. One in particular about a recurring event that some of you might want to get in on, the Wyoming Stoic Camp that runs yearly now, right? I think even in post-COVID times. Does that sound right? Now he's also, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's right. We're running it in May, Wyoming Stoic Camp, which is just perfect because it usually snows still up in the Rockies.
So you have some hardship to endure.
That's right.
He's also the co-director of Wyoming Pathways from Prison, which has prisoners, inmates, learning about Stoic philosophy as a way to help them get themselves back on track. He's got a number of publications, particularly about teaching philosophy, and his talk today is Theory, Practice, and Pepsis. So let me just turn it right over to you, Rob, and I'll let you take over.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. And, it's been a privilege and an honor to be here today with everybody. It's been some really cool stuff going on that I'm glad to be part of. So hopefully you can all see my screen.
Works good.
Okay. So today I want to talk a little bit about the connection between Stoic theory and Stoic practice, especially as found in the works of Epictetus. For today's purposes, I just want to say a little bit about what I mean by Stoic theory. We'll get to a little more detail in a bit. But what I mean by Stoic theory includes things like the technical details of the various topoi of logic, physics, and even ethics. And by Stoic practice, on the other hand, I mean the sorts of things that we do that are connected to Stoicism. We've had a lot of talk about that today, right? Such as exercises, like even going to the gym or things like that, the sorts of things we sometimes hear about in the text, like sleeping on the floor, but also things like journaling and various meditative practices and things like that. So I'm going to start off, and I intend this to be a little bit provocative, but here's my 2 main points for the day. So hopefully we can get to that. Here's the first one. There's no such thing as Stoic practice without an appropriate connection to Stoic theory. And my second thesis for the day is that at least one important way of establishing that appropriate connection is provided by the process of Pepsis, right, is the term in the Greek, right, which is the metaphor is that of digestion, right? Just like our stomach medicines that we can buy at the store. They're good for digestion. So to establish this, I'm going to try to say a few more things about Stoic theory and Stoic practice. And then I want to look at a few important passages from Epictetus that help us articulate and understand the notion of Pepsis and how it connects those things. And then finally, I want to draw a few conclusions about how we ought to best incorporate Stoicism into our own lives. So I'm going to try to get to all that in plenty of time, so there's still some time for questions. Okay, so here's a bit fuller statement of what I mean by Stoic theory. By Stoic theory, I mean the interconnected principles, fundamental and derived, that form the basis of the Stoic ideas of truth, reality, nature, and the like. Such principles include, but aren't limited to, some of these famous examples, some of which we've talked about quite a bit already today. Some things are up to us and some things are not, which famously is the first sentence of Epictetus's Enchiridion. And other ones you can find in some of the older Stoics, like virtue is the only good, and that the goal is living in agreement with nature or living consistently, I think, as Chris Gill talked about. In addition to these familiar ones, I'd also include things like principles about the underlying deterministic structure of the causal world, stuff about the nature of possibility and necessity that we can find in places like the fragments of Chrysippus, the theory of emotion articulated by Seneca in works like On Anger and so on. Now, these sorts of theoretical principles usually don't by themselves articulate the sort of actionable advice we find in so many of the Roman Stoic texts that we're also familiar with, right? Like Marcus's advice to treat even those who irritate you as your brothers and sisters, like he does in Meditations 2:1, or Musonius Rufus's advice about eating like a philosopher in his lecture 13. Now, I think theory and the understanding of it are absolutely essential to living as a Stoic. One must understand fully principles such as these ones on the screen. Some things are up to us and some are not. But not only do we have to understand them as true things, but we also have to sort of understand why they're truth. That is, how they fit into the whole theoretical structure, right? So the idea that some things are up to us and some things are not, the so-called dichotomy of control, that's true in the Stoic theory, but it's also true in part, well, it's mostly true because of its relationship to the physics and the physical theory that the Stoics had. That is, the way the world works. The way the world is causally structured makes it such that some of those things can be up to me and some aren't. And it's not a mere statement that stands on its own as some sort of obvious self-evident truth, but it's rather a piece of an entire theory of nature and of our place in it. And it's because of this embeddedness in that theory, I think, that it gets its power. And this is just one example. We could do similar things for the other cases as well. Now, on the other hand, by Stoic practice, I mean more or less what French scholar Pierre Hadot meant by spiritual exercises. That is, I include such things as one might do with any philosophical tradition, things like study, discussion, and memorization, and religious traditions as well often emphasize those things too, but also exercises that are not the sort of thing you do in a classroom, things like maybe physical deprivations, right? Fasting or taking cold showers, or going to the gym and being disciplined about that sort of thing. And of course, meditation and journaling as well. Now, all of these have references in the Stoic texts as we have them in the ancient Stoic texts, so it's easy to see why we might think of them as fundamentally Stoic. But as we all know, I think just about all of these practices are also recommended by any number of other religious, spiritual, and philosophical traditions. So what makes them Stoic? So here's my main point, right? It's only by virtue of these exercises being somehow grounded in Stoic theory, in the sorts of things I had on the last slide, that they're Stoic exercises at all, properly speaking. Now, many people have noticed, rightly, that Epictetus and other Stoics argue that the study of theory is not all there is to philosophy. In fact, it's that insight that seems to underlie the sort of things that Hadot is so famous for, right? And also the whole philosophy as a way of life approach. What I think is noticed less often is that the connection between Stoic theory and Stoic practice is a two-way path. That is, on the one hand, while the study of theory is incomplete without its resulting in action in our way of living, on the other hand, mere action without being the result of appropriate theoretical considerations is also incomplete. So let's look at a passage. Right, here's a passage from Epictetus' Enchiridion. This is 46. Never call yourself a philosopher, so I'm just going to read it out loud so we can all sort of resonate with it a bit. And don't talk among laymen for the most part about philosophical principles, but act in accordance with those principles. At a banquet, for example, don't talk about how one ought to eat, but eat as one ought. And accordingly, if any talk should arise among laymen about some philosophical principle, keep silent for the most part, for there's a great danger that you'll simply vomit up what you haven't properly digested. So we're getting rich into these digested metaphors. So when the day arrives when someone tells you that you know nothing, and you, like Socrates, aren't upset by that, you may be sure that you're making a start on your work as a philosopher. For sheep, too, don't vomit up their fodder to show the shepherds how much they've eaten, but digest their food inside them and produce wool and milk on the outside. And so you likewise shouldn't show off your principles to laymen, but rather show them the actions that result from those principles when they've been properly digested. Now, many people notice, again rightly, the emphasis at the beginning of the passage, which seems to indicate that it's not very important, or at least often out of place, So engage in talking about philosophy all the time. If you've ever been to a cocktail party where somebody just wants to talk about philosophy, I mean, maybe that's great for me, but might not be for everybody all the time. After all, talk is just talk, right? What matters for Stoics is that you do the things that Stoicism tells you to, right? As it says in this passage here, don't talk about how one ought to eat, but eat as one ought. Stoicism is, of course, a philosophy of action. Do it. Don't waste time talking about it, to sort of refer to a well-known passage of Marcus. But less often noticed, it seems to me, is something expressed in the last sentence of this passage. And I'll read it again. And so you likewise shouldn't show off your principles to laymen, but rather show them the actions that result from those principles when they've been properly digested. That's the Pepsis bit. Note carefully the direction of causation expressed in this sentence. What matters here are the actions which are the result of the digestion of the principles. So not just any actions will do, only those that are the result of digesting Stoic principles. So this is what counts for making progress, or whether it counts as making progress, for judging whether actions are truly Stoic or not. Are those actions the result of the proper digestion of the Stoic principles that underlie them? And here I think we could also, in the case of digestion, talk about incorporation, right? Are we incorporating these principles into our actions? And I think, the root of incorporation is same as that of corpse, right? We bring it into our bodies, right? So the digestion of these principles is precisely, and I think exclusively, what makes these Stoic actions Stoic as opposed to something else. So I think this is reinforced from another well-known passage from Epictetus. This is where I got sort of my part of my title, and this is from the Discourses. Suppose I were talking to an athlete and I said, "Show me your shoulders," and he were to reply, "Look at my jumping weights." That's quite enough of you and your weights. What I want to see is what you've achieved by use of those jumping weights. Take the treatise on motivation and see how thoroughly I've read it. Right? That's the theory bit, right? That's not what I'm seeking to know, slave, but how you're exercising your motives to act and not to act, and how you're managing your desires and aversions, and how you're approaching all of this and how you're applying yourself to it and preparing for it, and whether in harmony with nature or out of harmony with it. So in this passage, it seems, reading things such as the important treatises of Stoicism, the treatise on motivation, for example, that's all fine and good, but it's not really the point. The point is all the other stuff: how to exercise proper motives to act, how to manage desires and aversions, and so on. Again, the point is not the theory all by itself. But what then's the role of the jumping weights? Which I've never quite figured out what those really are supposed to look like, but maybe somebody could tell me. It's pretty clear that in this passage, the jumping weights are some sort of workout tools, right? It's the sort of things we use to develop our bodies and their ability to function. So one parallel, which most interpreters notice again, is that the jumping weights in this metaphor are like studying technical Stoic treatises, right? Perhaps the sort of study and discussion that when I listed some of the exercises, right? But most interpreters, I think, don't pay as much attention to the fact that the jumping weights are things one uses in action. What sorts of actions? Well, the actions of the gym, the ones that with which we train ourselves, right? So more broadly, the simile of the jumping weights points at the difference between exercises and the living of a life for which those exercises prepare us. As the passage puts it, show me, quote, what you've achieved by use of those jumping weights, end quote. And what are those things, the things we achieve? Exercising your motives to act and not act, managing desires and aversion, and living in harmony with nature. So one more passage that I think brings this all together a bit, also from Epictetus' Discourses, and this is 321. Those who have taken in the principles raw and without any dressing immediately want to vomit them up again, just as people with weak stomachs bring up their food. Digest them first, and then you won't vomit them up in this way. Otherwise, they do indeed become nothing more than vomit, foul stuff that isn't fit to eat. But after having digested them, Show us some resulting change in your ruling center, right? In the hegemonicon, the part that makes our decisions. Just as athletes show in their shoulders the result of their exercises and diet, and those who've become expert craftsmen can show the results of what they've learned. A builder doesn't come forward and say, listen to me as I deliver a discourse about the builder's art, but he acquires a contract to build a house and shows through actually building it that he's mastered the art. And you, for your part, should follow a similar course of action. Eat as a proper human being. Drink as a proper human being. Dress, marry, father children. Perform your public duties. Put up with being abused. Put up with an inconsiderate brother. Put up with a father, a son, a neighbor, a fellow traveler. Show us these things to enable us to see that you've really learned something from the philosophers. So, if we look at what all these passages bring together, the true Stoic, the one who's progressing, the prokopton, is not someone, and this is what people always notice, who can recite chapter and verse the texts of Stoicism like an expert scholar. Nor is it, on the other hand, someone who's really good at enduring cold showers or super disciplined at the gym and talking about their gains. Both of these ways of being Stoic fall short of being small s Stoic. Really fall short of being a capital S Stoic in this full sense. Rather, being fully Stoic involves not just both of these aspects, theory and practice, but a proper integration of them through the process of Pepsis, or digestion. This is why the metaphor of Pepsis is so appropriate. When have we digested the principles of Stoicism? Well, not when we can just repeat them and produce quotes at will. This is just showing everybody our vomit. We've eaten but not just digested. Want proof that I've eaten something? Here's my barf, right? It's the sort of thing you might get on an exam in a classroom or something like that, right? Maybe we have eaten, but it's only through the process of a digestion that we can get to the real point of eating. And the metaphor is, of course, the real point of all of this is living. So when do our practices become Stoic? When do things like journaling or taking cold showers or sleeping on a reed mat become Stoic exercises? Well, when they're part of the process of Pepsis itself. That is, when doing the particular exercises done precisely for the point of incorporating the Stoic principles into our lives in a fully lived way. That is, when the exercises are part of the process of Pepsis, or of producing the wool, to go back to the sheep example, right? Or when it's about developing our ability to choose how to act and how not to act, how to develop our consideration about what we desire and what we're averse to, and so on. So, look, journaling is great. Lots of traditions recommend it. But what makes journaling, for example, a properly Stoic exercise, or what makes a case of journaling a case of Stoic journaling? Well, is the journaling about developing the discipline of assent? That is, do I journal to practice the skills that allow me to discern what things are up to me and what things are not? Do they help me to recognize and apply principles such as virtue is the only good? Well, then this sort of journaling is properly Stoic, and fully so. On the other hand, do I take cold showers just to develop my mental toughness and prove how much I can endure? Well, that's probably not Stoic, at least not by itself. We might have a further story to tell that might show that it is, but maybe not too, right? Or do I sleep on a reed mat so that other people can see how awesome I am at being Stoic? If that's what's really motivating me to do this sort of thing, and it's, again, not connected in some way to those more fundamental Stoic principles, then it's definitely not Stoic. So with any of my actions, right, why I'm doing that action and the theory in which it's embedded make all the difference about whether my actions, such as any of these exercises, meditation, discussion, sleeping on a reed mat, going to the gym, are Stoic or not, or even if they're spiritual exercises at all in Hadot's sense, as opposed to, say, exercises in vanity. So, just bring it back again, right? That's my main claim. No exercise, nothing that we do is a Stoic practice unless it's properly connected to Stoic theory through this process of digestion that takes time and effort and energy. And that's it. So hopefully I've prodded a little bit of discussion with that. So thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, we do have a question that is being asked in the YouTube chat from Sharif. Can you share some of your personal Stoic practices?
Sure. Yeah, right. Generally, I try to journal, right? I don't always do it every day. But when I journal, what I try to do is center it about these Stoic principles. My journaling practice involves taking central bits of the Stoic text and thinking about how I might connect it to my day, things I might have coming up, right? So is, for example, the dichotomy of control going to be central in a day that I might see, coming at me? I also like to keep various principles at hand, right? I wrote a few years ago about an incident in
which is in Stoicism Today, Volume 3, I think.
That's right. So I my first big international trip to New Zealand, and I almost died. And I remembered being in the hospital in terrible pain, the worst pain I'd ever had, and thinking of the back end of Enchiridion 1, right, where it says, you are just an appearance and not at all the thing that has the appearance. And I tried to say that to my pain, and it didn't really solve it, but it helped a bit. Yeah. So those are a couple.
So here's a good one that just came in from JB. How has teaching prisoners affected your personal Stoic practice?
Well, I could say a lot about that, right? So one of the things when I teach in prison, so here's the difference. When you teach 18, 19, 20-year-olds, and you probably know this, Greg, convincing them that things like your body are not under your control, they aren't always so convinced, right? What do you mean I can't control my body, right? Whereas if you talk to someone who's incarcerated, they know very well that lots of things can inhibit what you might choose to do with your body, right? So whether you can leave your 7x14 cell is there's definitely situations in which that's not up to you. So that's a big thing. Another big thing that's easy. So one of the things so let me just sort of take a step back. When I teach incarcerated people Stoicism, it's very different from, say, if I'm talking to Wall Street people, right? And they're interested, I mean, for some obvious reasons, right? But they're also, I think, much more receptive to the idea that eudaimonia, right, happiness, right, is based entirely in things that are up to me, and that's really a very limited set of things. They aren't worried when they're stuck in prison for 20 years or whatever about whether or not they can make their mortgage payment. Whereas, for most of the rest of us who get to, well, should I buy a new car this year or not? Right? It's a whole different set of concerns, I think. But I think that also brings home to me the general applicability of the Stoic principles, is that the same questions come up. They might sort of appear in different contexts, but the same things are really important.
So here's another question that just came in, and a bit of a challenge here.
Okay.
From Alexander. Why do you think it makes sense to reflect on a theory that's outdated in several aspects when practicing Stoic exercises?
Alexander. Well, because I think the aspects in which Stoicism is outdated are empirical. Whereas I think, so the inadequacy of, say, the empirical knowledge they had about subatomic particles or something like that,
Yeah.
is, I think, not relevant to the sort of conceptual structure in this case, right? I think there's conceptual structures that could be screwed up more or less by empirical stuff, but I'm not convinced yet that the empirical things the Stoics got wrong or were completely ignorant of really matter to principles like some things are up to us and some things are not, right? I have a terrible time accepting the doctrine of total mixture, for example. I just don't think that's true. But I don't think that matters to the question of what my causal role is in the world as an agent with a with a ruling center that says that assents or doesn't, right? I think that still makes sense within the context of modern science. So that's my short answer, I guess. But
there was another one, and I'm not quite sure who's asking this because I'm getting it through the back channel from Phil. People who are coming to your workshops are obviously more interested than most in Stoicism. So what themes show up and what they're particularly looking for?
Oof. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, it's from Phil.
Oh, it's from Phil. Okay. Okay, Phil. Well, so for short answer, come to Wyoming Stoic Camp and find out. But and that's true for everybody here. I think it varies from year to year and from group to group. Some of the things that come up a lot, when we go up to do Wyoming Stoic Camp up in the mountains of the snowy range of the Rockies, and we're sitting up there looking across the valley, and there might be a moose going through the campsite and all of that, right? One of the things that comes up a lot is how do we think about nature, right? And that was one of the sort of original motivations for me doing Wyoming Stoic Camp nearly a decade ago now. The first time was here in Wyoming, we do nature quite a bit, right? But of course, the Stoic conception of nature is even broader than that. It's not just about rocks and trees and moose and the occasional mountain lion. It's also about, these headphones on my head through which I'm speaking to everybody over vast distances via the magic of the internet, right? All of this is nature, right? So we often spend a lot of time thinking about nature and causality and how we fit into that picture. So we spend a lot of time doing big picture, I guess, theoretical questions often. But then we also get to spend a lot of time, because we spend hours together talking about this stuff. Hey, how do we deal with this particular problem? And how does that connect to everything we've been doing? So
here's what might be our last question,
okay,
if we want to stay on track. So this is from Matt. If wisdom is indeed as rare as a phoenix, do we ever end up digesting the Stoic principles, or is that a never-ending process?
As far as I can tell, it's never ending, right? Because I keep growing new hair through my digestion and producing wool, I guess. Yeah, right. So the sage is as rare as the phoenix, and only the sage is wise, and the rest of us are fools, is all standard Stoic doctrine. But there's also the possibility of progress, right? And possibility of progress is a function of how hard we work at it, and how long we work at it, and do we work at it with others who benefit our journey, and things like that. So I anticipate it's going to be never ending, or at least it's going to end only when I do. And as Marcus says in Meditations, I think it's 10:3. I could be off by a little bit, right? Everything that happens to me happens in such a way that I'll either survive it or I won't. If I survive it, I will have found what I need to do it, and if not, that'll be end of me. And in either case, there's no need to worry, and I just get to keep going forward, and until I don't. And I'm grateful for that. Maybe that's a good place to stop.
Well, thank you so much for giving this talk and
Yeah,
for
thanks for
your
inviting
answers
me.
to the questions.